The darkest corner of the room seemed to breathe. It wasn't the kind of shadow you'd explain away with a poorly positioned lampshade or a random reflection. No, that darkness had a weight, a density that seemed to pull the air around it. St. Mary's Hospital in a small town in rural Ohio had always been quiet in the wee hours, but in that isolated wing, in room 312, the silence didn't bring peace. It carried a suffocating tension. Passers-by swore they felt a chill run down their spine, as if someone or something was watching them from behind the closed door. Nurses avoided going in there alone, and patients who spent more than a few hours in that room requested a transfer before nightfall. There were reports of sheets sinking by themselves, heart monitors going off for no apparent reason, and most of all, that invisible presence that seemed to follow every breath, as if waiting for someone to finally look into the darkness for too long. And that night, someone did. Claire Reynolds, a nurse for over 15 years, thought she'd seen it all, until she walked into room 312 during shift change. The patient was awake, pale, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the wall where the shadows gathered like thick smoke. "Is everything okay in here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't answer. He just raised a trembling finger and pointed into the darkness. Claire followed the gesture and felt her heart race. There was no clear shape, but the darkness seemed to pulse, swell, and retract, as if inhaling the same air she was breathing. A low, wet sound echoed from it, something between a sigh and a throat crack. The patient began to cry softly. The lights in the room flickered, and for a split second, Claire saw something move within the shadows, like a slender body writhing against the wall. When she blinked, everything was still, but the feeling that something had approached was so strong that she didn't notice. The shadow was now just inches from the foot of the bed. St. Mary's Medical Center is 2 hours from Columbus, Ohio, a pale concrete block surrounded by empty parking lots and trees that shed their leaves too soon, as if the wind there were in a greater hurry than anywhere else. At night, the helipad lights flicker on and off at regular intervals, cutting through the darkness with a metallic pulse that echoes through the glass, through the hallways, through the hearts of those working past midnight. The East Wing is the oldest. The walls hold layers of paint and stories no one wanted to hear again. That's where they installed room 312, a rectangle of cool air at the end of a hallway, long enough to swallow footsteps and return only the last echoes. The monitors there always seemed a little more sensitive, as if any noise on the other side of the wall could turn into arrhythmia, apnea, or failure. During the early morning shift, the hospital changes its language. The carpet speaks with a whisper of fibers. The air conditioning laments a hollow wheeze, and the automatic doors, which sound practical during the day, sound like lazy guillotines at night. 312 has the narrowest window in the wing, opening onto a courtyard where an annex once stood. Demolished, they say, due to structural problems. In the archives, this word appears so often that it has become synonymous with "let's not discuss it." The St. Mary's site, say the elders, belonged to an orphanage destroyed by fire in 1921. They reported thick smoke, children hiding in the basement, wooden corridors that creaked like bones in the heat. The hospital's foundations were laid on top of the intact basements, faster and cheaper, they said at the time, and the East Wing rose directly over the area where the girls' dormitory once stood. None of this makes it into the welcome material for new employees, of course. What's included are the evacuation plans, the medication routine, the mental map every nurse needs to get through their shift with, sanity. But what's not included is precisely what you'll eventually hear from any veteran after the third night. The 312 is wrong. It's not superstition, it's not a collective hallucination, it's not the effect of fatigue, it's the objective sensation that the air inside weighs differently. that the shadow on the corner of the ceiling doesn't follow the logic of the fluorescent light, that darkness has tides, ebbs, and flows. Some patients request transfers without being able to explain why. Others invent pain where there is none, tremble silently, stare at one spot, and refuse to move their necks. A janitor who retired early swears he heard slow breaths coming from the drywall while cleaning the vent, and that, when he put his ear close, the sound stopped as if someone was holding the air on the other side. The hospital has accumulated incidents, light bulbs that burn out faster, motion sensors going off in the middle of the night, cameras that shake without wind. And yet, 312 remains in use. A room is a room, and full beds keep the lights on. No one signs off on reports of strange things. They record electrical fluctuations, recommend checks, and follow up. Until, on a typical Monday night, the on-call staff received an unstable patient, and someone had to decide where to leave him. The hallway was crowded. 312 was empty. The door opened. Claire Reynolds never believed in stories of the afterlife. She believed in protocols, in warm baths to soothe tremors, in painkillers at the right time, and in dimmed lights to remind the patient that night exists. 15 years of nursing taught her that fear has a smell, acid sweat on the collar, a subtle metal on the tongue, and that the hospital amplifies everything like a sick church. At midnight, she wrote in the chart, male 34, car accident, superficial abrasions, moderate chest pain, saturating well, stable. Patient's name, Daniel Hart. Sunken eyes, excessive wakefulness, refusal to close his eyelids for more than a second. I just need light, he said, as she leaned the clipboard against the bed rail. The light stays on, please. Claire smiled the way she had learned to smile without making promises, and adjusted the dimmer to maximum. It'll be okay, she said, not as a lie but as a temporary shelter. The heart monitor alternated its disciplined beeps. The drip of the IV marked an additional beat, and for a while it seemed as if the world would obey. Then Claire noticed, every time she moved, toward the darkest corner on the left side of the room, a triangle of shadow where the ceiling light couldn't quite reach. Daniel's heart rate rose 2-3 notches, as if an invisible metronome had accelerated in the patient's consciousness. It retreated, the rate dropped. It approached, it rose. Claire tested it twice. The third time she stopped, because Daniel's face betrayed a truth no one confesses with words. The body recognizes before the mind. "Is someone there?" he asked, not looking. At her, staring into the darkness. "No," Claire replied automatically, feeling the muscle in his right shoulder twitch beneath his lab coat. "Is what there, Daniel?" He took a moment to answer, and when he did, it wasn't a word, but a sound. Shh. The shh an adult makes to quiet a child, but said as if it were coming from the other side of a thick wall of water. Claire lifted her chin and decided to do what she always does when reality tries to bend the corners. She imposed a routine. She checked the catheter, checked medications, checked the temperature, the ritual of solid things holding the others in place. The digital clock in the corner of the TV read 12:37 a.m. She noted the time, took a deep breath, crossed the room, and stood right where the dimmer was losing its battle. The shadow there wasn't just darker, it was denser, like dust in a reversed sunbeam, invisible particles clumped together in a spot whose outline refused to change. "Nothing," she whispered, more to herself than to Daniel, and the monitor's beep responded with a jolt that sounded like discord. In the hallway, a cart creaked past. Life continued outside. Inside, the lamp flickered slightly, a pulse that could have been electrical wiring, or the mechanical equivalent of a sigh. Claire stepped back, the skin on her forearm prickling, and decided she needed another variable. She turned off the TV. The room was devoid of human noise for a moment too long. The air conditioning began to breathe again. And, in that pause, Claire felt something simple and undeniable. Someone was sharing her breath. It wasn't noise, it was rhythm. The cycle was opposite to her own, a filling when she emptied, a deflating when she filled, like two lungs that had decided to fight for the same room. "I'll get a blanket," she said, and Daniel nodded hurriedly, as if Claire's promise were a fragile spell. As she left, she glanced back, a reflex trained to check cables if the patient needed anything, if there was no danger, and for less than a second she was certain the shadow was millimeters ahead, as if she had tested her own boundary. When she returned with the blanket, Daniel's eyes were wet, his skin translucent. "She knows you're gone," he whispered, his voice cracking, not a cry but a fissure. Claire covered his feet, adjusted the railing, and made the only gesture one learns the hard way. She touched his shoulder with the palm of her hand, warmth against the cold. "I'm here." The beeping stabilized. The shadow moved, pretending not to. As 1 a.m. passes, the hospital seems suspended by invisible threads no one wants to pull. Doors grow gentle, the security radios go silent, and digital clocks guiltily slip away. Daniel blinked as if he feared missing some important scene the moment he closed his eyelids. Claire could feel the fatigue tightening his temples, the pain of someone watching an entire room alone. "You don't have to keep an eye on me," she said, but the sentence trailed off. "It's when I close my eyes," he replied. "When I close my eyes, she tries to remember my name with my own mouth." His chin trembled, and the next sentence came out garbled. "Sometimes she misses the syllable. Da, del, Dan," like a child learning. Claire felt the sentence dig a thin metal between her ribs, a shiver that wasn't cold, but pattern recognition. "Who is she, Daniel?" He took a shallow breath, as if the air were currency. "I don't know. But it's not a woman. It's the way she moves. It's like water pulling at the body." The monitor registered a jolt as a gurney hit some distant wall. Sound travels far in the wee hours. Claire sat in the chair, not for comfort but to equalize heights. "Will it help me if I stay here for a few minutes, looking where you're looking?" Daniel nodded, grateful and embarrassed. "It's always there," he pointed, "but sometimes it slides down the wall and gets closer to the floor. When you're here, it's quiet. When you leave, it comes down. And when it goes out, it breathes loudly." The two of them remained, the chair creaking slightly each time Claire shifted her position an inch. The corner seemed to settle into its own stillness. The invisible hand moved. At 1:19, an indecisive shape insinuated itself into the darkness, not an outline, but the threat of an outline, as if the shadow decided to experiment with the idea of having a body. Daniel held his breath. Claire thrust forward, instinct overcoming fear, fear serving as fuel. "See?" He whispered. "Don't look too much. She likes it when we look too much." The paradox of the sentence held Claire captive. Seeing to deny, deny to avoid attracting. The ceiling light emitted a new, very short buzz, and a vibration ran through the air conditioning grill. The walls seemed to sweat moisture, and then, as if the room had metabolized a secret, the sound came, a wet, muffled sigh coming from inside the corner. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a pipe. It was organic, with the unseemly honesty of body sounds. Claire stood without realizing she was standing, one step forward, another, and the monitor beeped again, the rhythm quickening accordingly. "Come back," Daniel urged, a child calling for light in the hallway. Claire stopped where the floor changes brightness, that invisible boundary where the cleanliness of the day and the oblivion of the night meet. "Okay," she said, and took a step back. The shadow seemed to adjust its focus as if a living lens were studying them. "She comes. When you're not looking," Daniel repeated, now with the soft voice of someone handing a sharp object with the handle pointing forward. When no one's looking, she likes to practice getting into bed. The sentence lingered between them, impossible to keep in mind. Get into bed how? Like who sits down first, then lies down? The sheet, smooth until then, showed a tiny desire to give way in the center, a dip of less than a millimeter, enough for her brain to tick off the list of things that shouldn't happen. Claire nodded, one decision following another. She would register, she would check the curtain rail, she would check the window seal, she would request a maintenance assessment if necessary. Each resolution was a brick against a river. And yet she remained there, her body saying, stay a little longer. The hospital breathing patiently. At 1:38, Daniel dozed for 5 seconds. The beeping slowed, the sheet remained smooth. But the corner didn't. The shadow seemed to gain. Wait, if shadows can, and Claire, who doesn't believe in ghosts, had a physical certainty. There was someone in the room besides them. The certainty didn't come dressed as an image. It came in the form of a missing reflection, a shift in air, a smell of something damp that didn't belong in a sterile environment. She leaned forward, her hand resting on the bed railing to find something to hold on to, and waited for the blow that didn't come. The hospital waited with her. The minute passed. Daniel opened his eyes like someone returning underwater, and the first thing he did was look for the corner. She didn't leave, he said. I know, Claire replied, and that honesty aligned them in a new way. The night wasn't even halfway there yet. But before continuing the story, check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because there is a new video here every day. The scream wasn't Daniel's. It was from another ward, someone holding back acute pain at 2:06. Corridors capture all pain and redistribute it, and 312 received a fraction of that sound, like someone receiving a letter that wasn't theirs. Daniel jumped onto the stretcher. Claire raised her hand in a gesture of calm and almost touched his face, almost. Stay with me. He did. The beeper held its own for a while, then stumbled aimlessly, as if the heart were testing new steps. A draft passed through the room without the door having opened, one of those internal winds that shouldn't exist. The curtain fluttered, not enough to create shadows, but enough to indicate movement. It's starting, Daniel said, and Claire didn't ask, what? The sheet, smooth, sacralized, stretched with an almost military elegance at the start of the shift, gave in the exact spot where someone would sit if they decided to lean against a friend's bed, a small depression on the right side near the foot. Claire considered thermal expansion, air trapped beneath the blanket, tricks of vision, but none of these things matter. Only weight matters. Carol, the nursing technician from another ward, pushed a cart outside, and the squeak of metal on rubber tracks filtered through the crack in the door like a mundane reminder that the world exists. In 312, the sheet sank another ½ centimeter, the bed creaking just enough to allow reality to acknowledge the occurrence. Claire swallowed God's name, because in the hospital, God's name takes on a volume she didn't want. The edge of the blanket straightened on its own and then turned toward the sinking, as if an invisible thigh had adjusted to fit. She sits first, Daniel repeated, and now it was no longer a memory, it was a living description. The monitor beeped, those 3 sequential beeps that warn you to look here, and Claire looked, adjusted the sensor and adjusted the clip on Daniel's finger, all with the competent gesture of someone who solves small things to endure the big one. When she touched the mattress with her hand, she felt a vibration, a tremor so subtle it would pass for a whim of the skin if it didn't have rhythm. It was the kind of vibration you feel when a cat steps too lightly on the comforter, a weightless presence, a weightless weight. "Daniel, breathe with me," she said, and together they counted 4 beats to enter, 4 to hold, 6 to leave. The sheet stopped sinking. The shadow didn't. The corner of the room began to pulse silently again, expanding and contracting as if sipping the calm they were manufacturing piece by piece. The clock ticked grudgingly. At 2:21, the light bulb flickered, an almost elegant chiaroscuro, and through an invisible frame of the world, Claire saw what she didn't want to see. Something long, writhing on the wall, a shape taller than an adult, compressed, as if born between mortar and brick and learning there to adopt the geometry of people. "Did you see?" Daniel asked, and Claire took a second to decide in which world to respond. "I saw," she said. The word settled like a full stop and, paradoxically, opened a new page. The hospital, attentive, muted everything inessential. And then the bed moved a centimetre to the left, a timid jerk, as if 2 hands had pulled and given up halfway. Claire gripped the railing tightly, and the iron returned a resolute chill. "Enough," she said to the air, but it was the air conditioning that responded, coughing water through the ducts. From the corner, a damp noise crossed the room and stopped in the space between their mouths and ears. That, no man's land where words decide whether they exist. It didn't become a word, it became a presence. The IV bubbled, the needle on the back of Daniel's hand trembled painlessly, and the monitor, beneficent, decided to stabilize. Claire summoned what courage remained, touched the depression in the sheet with her ribs, as if asking permission from an unknown animal, and felt only cold fabric and air. No tricks, no wires. "I'm recording," she said, and opened the chart. She wrote, "Patient reports, perception of presence, sinking observed in bed." She paused before typing, "No visible physical agent." In life, as in nursing, certain phrases require you to choose what kind of person you want to be. She closed the chart. "Let's keep the lights on," she added, and the shadow, if shadows can hear, seemed pleased. Claire's first day off after that night was restless. At home, she tried to distract herself with mundane tasks, ironing clothes, watering plants, making coffee, but the feeling that she had left something unfinished at the hospital wouldn't leave her. The next morning, before clocking out, she decided to stop by the basement where the old archives were kept. The place smelled of aged paper mixed with dust and rusted metal. The filament bulbs cast warm, slow shadows, very different from the cold, anxious ones of the East Wing. Claire asked the archivist on duty for access to the charts and reports related to room 312. He chuckled, as if hearing an inside joke, and said, "You're not the first to ask, but it's best not to waste too much time on this." Still, he brought a heavy cardboard box marked with a faded label, "Wing East, Room 312. Inside were leather folders with yellowed pages dating back to the 1940s. At first, they were standard medical records, blood pressure drops, pneumonia, fractures. But starting in the 1950s, unusual entries began to emerge. Patient claims to feel someone sitting on the bed. Monitor showing unexplained spikes. Another, from 1958, signed by Dr. Howard Gaines, amorphous shadow on the wall opposite the bed. Patient claims to be breathing, observation not confirmed by staff. The more I read, the more the narrative repeated itself, as if different people were describing the same event with slight variations. A 1966 report mentioned a child lying on the floor who disappeared when the nurse turned on the light. In 1974, another case, patient reports hearing his own name whispered, transferred to room 210 after panic attack. But it was a 1983 file that froze Claire. The folder contained black and white photos of the room. In one of them, the darkest corner was out of focus, as if the film had melted. On the back, someone had written, "It wasn't a camera defect." At the bottom of the box, he found a smaller envelope sealed with yellowed tape. Inside was a typed letter. To anyone who finds this, room 312 should not remain in use. It's not just psychological. Something in this space responds to people. It grows with them. It's not always visible, but it breathes. Closing it doesn't solve the problem. It waits. It always waits. Claire read those words over and over, as if the repetition would change their meaning. She tucked the letter into the inside pocket of her lab coat, not out of courage, but out of fear that it would disappear if she left it there. Claire's second shift at 312 started quieter than the first. Daniel seemed less agitated, but not relaxed, like someone accepting the fact that they're in a leaky boat, just holding onto a bucket to keep from sinking too quickly. At 12:42 a.m., while recording measurements in the electronic medical record, Claire felt a subtle change in temperature. The air was chilly, but not uniformly. A specific spot just behind her neck felt colder than the rest of the room. It was as if someone had opened a freezer just inches from her. Instinctively, he reached for the back of his neck. At the same moment, a tiny draft brushed his skin, accompanied by something that wasn't sound, but presence, the invisible weight of someone leaning in to whisper. She didn't hear words, but she felt the rush of air toward her ear. Daniel noticed her reaction. "Don't turn," he said, his voice low and firm. Claire froze. The monitor's beeping quickened, not the patient's, but her own heart beating in her temples. "She's right behind you," Daniel added, with the unnatural calm of someone describing something inevitable. Claire took a deep breath and, defying the warning, slowly turned. Her face. For a moment, she saw the air distort, like heat rising from asphalt, only cold, and she felt clearly, breath fanning her face, a damp blast that couldn't have come from anyone else. A blink broke the moment. The corner remained the same, motionless. But the sensation that something had moved 2 steps away was so clear it seemed to leave traces on the skin. Have you ever witnessed a supernatural event? Tell us your story in the comments. Around 2 in the morning, rain began to pound against the room's narrow glass. The light outside wavered as streetlights flickered in the storm. Claire was sitting in the armchair facing Daniel when she noticed something strange. In the window's reflection, there were 3 figures. The first was her, the second was Daniel. The third, too tall, too thin, and leaning forward as if trying to hear something. Claire didn't move her head, only her eyes. In the reflection, the figure was behind the bed. But when she looked directly at that spot, there was nothing. She returned her gaze to the glass. Now the figure was closer, almost touching its chin to the headboard. "Daniel," she began, but he was already staring at the same reflection. "I know." The figure in the glass was faceless. It was a dark blur, but it still felt like someone was watching. A raindrop ran down the glass, cutting the silhouette in half, and in that same instant, the image vanished. Claire got up, walked to the window, and placed her hand against the glass. It was cold, but no colder than usual. When she turned to go back, she saw out of the corner of her eye that the reflection had returned, but now in the glass of the bedroom door, on the side that faced the hallway. At 3:07 a.m., the lights throughout the ward flickered twice and then went out. A complete silence fell over the hospital, broken only by the sound of rain. In 312, the darkness was total, so dense it felt like it clung to the skin. Claire stood still, counting in her head, waiting for the emergency generator to kick in. Then she heard a damp sound of footsteps on the floor, as if someone barefoot was slowly walking across the room. 1, 2, 3 steps. Then breathing, heavy, slurred, too close. The mattress creaked as if someone had leaned on it. Daniel gasped. "She's here!" Claire took a step back, slamming into the wall. The sound of footsteps circled the room, faster now, until it stopped suddenly. Then something cold touched her arm. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. The light snapped back on. The corner was empty, but there was a patch of moisture running down the wall from the very darkest point to the floor, as if something had just passed through it. The next day, Claire almost turned down the shift, but she returned, and as if the hospital sensed it, the late nights soon took their toll. As he organized medications on the counter, he heard, very clearly, his name. Claire. He turned around, but Daniel was asleep. Claire. Now the voice came from the corner. It was neither male nor female, but deep and drawn out, as if the syllables weighed too heavily to be spoken. He tried to convince himself it was his imagination. Then he heard it again, closer. Clue! Daniel's monitor went off. He woke with a start, pointing to the corner. She's calling you. Claire backed away until her back was against the door. The voice repeated, now so close it seemed to come from inside her own head, and in that instant she understood. The thing wasn't just connected to Daniel anymore. She had noticed it, and so it was now hers too. The next morning didn't give Claire a chance to prepare. The hospital seemed quieter than usual, as if the entire building were holding its breath. At 2:14 a.m., while she was logging data into the chart, she felt something touch her shoulder. It was quick but intense, a harsh cold, like ice covered in dust. She turned immediately, expecting to see Daniel, but he was motionless, eyes fixed. On the ceiling, his face pale. The dark corner seemed more dilated, as if the shadow occupied a few extra inches of wall. Within it, a strange movement, rapid ripples, like water being stirred. The monitor beeped in alarming sequence. Daniel began to tremble, and the expression on his face wasn't just fear, it was physical effort to keep from looking at the corner. Claire went to him and took his hand, but the cold sensation crept up her arm, a shiver that wouldn't stop on her skin and seemed to seep into her veins. At the same time, the shadow made a sudden movement, almost a leap, advancing a few inches across the floor toward the bed. Claire pulled Daniel against the railing, trying to pull him away, but felt resistance, as if an invisible force held her weight against the mattress, and then came the breathing, sharp, ragged, directly beside her ear, accompanied by a sharp crack, like wood breaking. On impulse she screamed, "Get out of here!" And everything stopped. The air grew heavy, but still. The beeping steadied. The corner remained dark, but still, as if it had never moved. But Claire knew. That retreat wasn't defeat. It was waiting. The next night, Claire entered 312 with a heavy heart and a decision. She would stay there until she understood, or until she could stay no longer. Daniel was restless, but not as terrified as before. He seemed to accept that the thing in the corner was part of the hours in that room. The first hour was silent. The sound of rain outside filled the gaps, and Claire even began to believe it would be a less intense night. But at 1:53, the singing changed. It wasn't gradual. It was as if someone had dimmed the light even further in that spot, making it almost solid. A dark line began to stretch across the floor, like a shadow growing on its own. Slowly, it approached the bed. Claire backed up against the opposite wall, but didn't take her eyes off the movement. The shadow crept up the side of the mattress, around the foot of the bed, and began to advance along the sheets toward Daniel. He was frozen, breathing too fast. When the shadow reached his chest, the beeping sounded, and Claire lunged to pull him away. But as she touched Daniel's body, she felt something like thin threads of cold wrap around her arm, pulling her down. Daniel gasped, and with a final gasp, the monitor made the continuous deathly sound of a straight line. Claire screamed for help, but before the door opened, she saw, with absolute clarity, the figure lying on top of Daniel's body, as if occupying the same space, merging with him. When other nurses entered, the shadow disappeared, but Claire knew it hadn't gone away. It had simply moved. After Daniel's death, Claire spent days collecting stories. Some were hallway whispers, others notes hidden in old medical records. A retired nurse said that in the 1990s, he saw a girl sitting on the floor of 312, playing with something invisible. When he blinked, she disappeared. One doctor recalled a terminally ill patient who, before dying, stared into the corner and said, "She's smiling now." A security guard reported seeing a shadow cross the closed bedroom door and follow the hallway until it disappeared into the wall. A janitor said he went in one morning to clean and saw the prints of 2 small hands pressed against the inside of the window glass, and there were no children in that ward. Each story reinforced the same conclusion. The thing in 312 wasn't always the same. It could change shape, distance, even intention, but it was always there. Claire transferred and never worked in the East Wing again. For months, she avoided thinking about room 312. She threw away the letter she'd found in the archives, as if that would sever the connection. But one rainy morning, she woke up at home with the feeling she was being watched. The room was dark, but not completely dark. There was a thicker shadow in the corner, a darkness that seemed to breathe. She stood still, her eyes fixed on that spot. His slow breathing, alternating with hers, was unmistakable, and then, in a drawn-out whisper, the voice spoke his name. Claire didn't turn on the light. He didn't scream. He just closed his eyes. And the story ends, leaving the question, is the presence linked to room 312, or does it follow those who dare to face it for too long? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.